It got sold 6 times. And every single owner looked at the one thing Howard Johnson's was actually selling and decided it cost too much money. Let's get into it. Start in Wollaston, Massachusetts in 1925, where a 28-year-old named Howard Deering Johnson buys a corner drugstore with a marble soda fountain in the back. He is not, on paper, a promising man. He left school around the 8th grade, and when his father died in 1921, he inherited a cigar business that was drowning. He could have walked away from his father's debts. Plenty of people did exactly that. But he took them on himself, somewhere around $40,000, which in 1921 money is a life sentence. So he borrows more and buys the drugstore, and he is now a pharmacist who doesn't know pharmacy in a shop he can't afford, sitting on a debt he can't pay. And then he looks at his own books. The pills aren't making money, the newspapers aren't making money, and the cigars, of all things, aren't making money. The soda fountain is making money, and the ice cream is making all of it. So he does the single most important thing he will ever do. He tastes his own ice cream and decides it isn't good enough. The trick is almost stupidly simple. The more butterfat you put in ice cream, the richer it tastes and the slower it melts on your tongue. And at the time, most states required a minimum of 10%, so most ice cream in America sat right at 10. Because 10% is cheaper. Johnson ran his at 18 to 19, nearly double the legal floor. He kept adding flavors too: butter pecan, black raspberry, frozen pudding, peppermint stick, on, until he had 28 of them lined up in the case. 28 flavors, and for the rest of his life the best seller was vanilla. Every single year. Vanilla. In 1926, he pays $300 for a stand on Wollaston Beach and starts selling cones for a nickel, and that summer that shack grosses around $60,000, including one Sunday where it moved 14,000 cones. The debt was gone, and Howard Johnson had learned the thing that would run the rest of his life. People will pay more and drive farther for the good version. So in June of 1929, he opens a full sit-down restaurant in Quincy Square, and 4 months later, the stock market collapses. This should be the end of the story. Instead, he gets saved by a censor. That same year, the mayor of Boston banned a play, Eugene O'Neill's Strange Interlude. It had already won a Pulitzer Prize, but it had abortion and infidelity and madness in it, and Boston decided the city could not handle that. So the Theater Guild moved the whole production out of Boston to a theater in Quincy, directly across the street from a brand new restaurant with an orange roof. And here's the part that makes it perfect. Strange Interlude ran 5 hours, and it had a dinner intermission built into the middle of it. So for weeks, every night, hundreds of the wealthiest people in Boston drove down to Quincy, watched half of a band play, walked across the street, and ate at Howard Johnson's. Boston tried to protect its citizens from a dirty play, and accidentally handed a broke pharmacist the best marketing campaign of the decade. And if you're over 50, you already know exactly what he built, because you've stood in one. The counter with the swivel stools your father let you spin on exactly twice before he stopped you. Turquoise and orange everywhere. The booths, the walls, the coffee cups, and that smell of fryer oil and coffee that every single one of them had, in every state forever, and the case, the glass case with the tubs in it, all 28 of them. And you standing there with your face 4 inches from the glass, taking it completely seriously, doing the math on butter pecan versus peppermint stick like the rest of your life depended on it. Friday night, all-you-can-eat fried clams, a plate of golden strips, and a paper cup of tartar sauce, and in the 1960s that plate was $1.25. And your parents weren't there for the food. They were there because they'd been driving for 4 hours, they were exhausted, and they knew that whatever was behind that orange roof was going to be exactly the same thing it was in the last state. That's the product, not the clams. Sameness, remember that, because in about 40 years a man with a Harvard MBA is going to look at what sameness costs and decide he can live without it. But first Johnson has to build it, and in 1935 he wants 25 more restaurants, and no bank in New England will lend to him, because nobody has ever done that, and out loud it sounds insane. So he calls a childhood friend named Reginald Sprague and makes him an offer that is, looking back, the blueprint for basically every chain restaurant you've ever eaten in. You build it with your money to my plans, exactly. You buy your ice cream from me, you buy your food from me, you run it my way, and you keep the profit. Sprague went $17,000 into debt to do it, and by the end of that first summer his restaurant was serving 700 meals a day, and he cleared the debt in 2 years. That's the invention, right there. Nobody had ever taken a full sit-down restaurant and cloned it exactly at somebody else's expense. Howard Johnson had figured out how to grow with no money, and by 1941 he had 170 restaurants and 10,000 employees built in the middle of the Great Depression. But he'd also created a problem that could destroy him, because the second you let a stranger in Ohio put your name on his building, you have no idea what he's serving. And if the clams in Ohio taste worse than the clams in Maine, the roof stops meaning anything, everywhere, all at once. So he wrote a manual, and everybody called it the Bible. Recipes, uniforms, architecture, how long to cook a Frankfurter, all of it standardized, in writing, in 1935. And then he did the expensive thing, and built an army of field supervisors whose entire job was driving around America, walking into his restaurants unannounced and checking. That inspection force is a pure cost, it generates nothing and sells nothing, and it's a line on the income statement that a smart person could delete tomorrow and nothing would happen for about 3 years. Circle that. It's the first gun on the wall. Now, the roof. The buildings looked like New England churches, white clapboard, dormer windows, a cupola, the kind of building your grandmother got married in. And then Johnson put a screaming orange porcelain roof on it, for one reason, because he believed it was the color the human eye catches fastest from a moving car. He was right, and that roof was the entire advertising budget. Howard Johnson's barely bought ads, ever, because it didn't have to. You'd be doing 60 miles an hour with 3 kids fighting in the back seat, and a mile ahead you'd catch a flash of orange through the trees, and the argument in the car was already over. But a promise you can see from a mile away only works if what's behind it is worth the exit. Which brings us to the number that gets this whole company killed. Howard Johnson's ran food costs as high as 48% of revenue. 48 cents of every dollar going right back onto the plate. The highest in the industry by a wide margin, and for comparison, a place like Chipotle today runs around 35. To Howard Deering Johnson, that wasn't a problem, that was the business. Quality sells. That was the entire religion. To anybody who reads a spreadsheet, 48% is the biggest, fattest, most obvious pile of money in the building. Gun number 2. Loaded, sitting there for 25 years. And here's what it bought. It bought the clams, which exist because of a man who hated clams. Thomas Safran was a Greek immigrant out of Ipswich, Massachusetts, and he was a famously picky eater, and the thing he could not stand was the belly, that soft, dark, gritty part in the middle of a fried clam. So he cut it out and used only the tough foot of the surf clam sliced into strips. Johnson tried them and locked him up with an exclusive contract that ran 32 years, so nobody else in America could serve them. The most iconic item on the menu got invented by a guy who didn't want to eat the gross part, but all of it, the roof, the manual, the inspectors, the 48%, rests on one assumption: that people are driving. So in 1940, when America opened its first modern superhighway, the Pennsylvania Turnpike, a road with no cross traffic and no towns and nowhere to eat, Howard Johnson's won the exclusive food contract. Every service plaza, the entire road. You are on a highway you cannot leave, you are hungry, there is one restaurant. And it is Howard Johnson's. That's a captive audience with a fence around it. And then they did it again and again. 40-year exclusive contracts, one road at a time. Remember that number, 40, because in 1940 they signed a deal that runs out in 1980, and nobody in that room is losing sleep over 1980. They should have been losing sleep over 1941 because the war comes and the government rations gasoline, and by 1944 Howard Johnson's is down to about 12 restaurants out of more than 200. 90% of it gone. The ice cream saved him because his sugar and cream quotas kept the commissaries running, feeding shipyards and war plants. And there's a lesson available in that, a loud one. You just watched your entire company evaporate because it was chained to the American highway, and a careful man diversifies. Howard Johnson did the opposite. He bet everything on the road, harder than before, and for 25 years he looked like a genius. Because the war ends and the greatest customer base in human history walks out the door and buys a car. In 1956, the Interstate Highway Act passes, and buried in it is a rule almost nobody thinks about. No service plazas on the interstates. You could not build a restaurant on the highway itself. That should have been a catastrophe. Instead, Howard Johnson's went out and bought the exit ramps, land right off the off-ramp, big enough for a motor lodge and a restaurant side by side at interchanges all over the country. And somewhere in the 1960s, without anybody quite deciding it. Howard Johnson stopped being a restaurant company that owned some land and became one of the largest owners of highway real estate in the United States that happened to serve clams. Gun number 3. That dirt is the reason Marriott buys this company in 1985, and it will have nothing to do with what's on the menu. But before any of that, they hit the top. In 1960, Howard Johnson's hired a young French chef out of Le Pavillon, the most serious French restaurant in New York, named Jacques Pépin. Yes, that Jacques Pépin, the man who cooked for Charles de Gaulle, the man who turned down John F. Kennedy's offer to be the White House chef. He turned down the White House and went to work for a highway restaurant chain, spending 10 years at a commissary in Brockton, Massachusetts, where a normal day meant boning 1,000 turkeys. And what did he actually do there? He pulled the margarine out and put butter back in, and he pulled the dehydrated onion out and put a real onion back in. That's what 48% buys. Butter instead of margarine, and a real onion times 400 restaurants, times 10 million plates. Nobody was ever going to notice, and nobody was ever going to write in and say the onion tastes different. That's the whole point. That's what the number was for. And it worked. 1965, 770 restaurants, and sales bigger than McDonald's, Burger King, and Kentucky Fried Chicken put together at a moment when McDonald's had roughly 700 stores of its own. Through the 60s, Howard Johnson served more meals outside the home than any organization in America except the United States Army. One drugstore in Quincy, 40 years, and you are now second only to the military. If you're enjoying this trip back, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next brand we dig into. Because 6 years before that peak, the founder handed the whole thing to his son, and the son could read a spreadsheet. Everybody called him Bud. Andover, then Yale, then Harvard Business School, and he was 26 years old when his father made him president in 1959. Bud's own joke was that his father felt he should start at the top and work his way down. It's funny, and it's also a fairly accurate summary of the next 20 years. Because he found the guns. 48% first, the biggest number on the page, defended by nothing but his dead father's opinion that quality sells. So he cut it. Then he cut the marketing. And then he found the inspectors, a field force paid every week, producing nothing, selling nothing, driving around America looking at restaurants that were fine. So he cut that too. And nothing happened. For about 3 years, nothing happened at all. which is exactly what a Harvard MBA would expect, and exactly what the man who built the company would have told him was coming. Because go back to that dining room. Your parents weren't there for the food, they were there because they knew what they were going to get. Sameness was the product. So when the clams stopped tasting the same in Ohio as they did in Maine, Howard Johnson's didn't lose a menu item, it lost the only thing it had ever actually sold. And it took 10 years to show up in the numbers, which meant nobody could point at the moment it happened. Then the joke started. Howard Johnson's ice cream comes in 28 flavors, and its food comes in 1. Here's another one from the era: fast food, served slow. Meanwhile, the old man would not let go. Howard Deering Johnson, retired in his 70s, kept running surprise inspections, rolling into parking lots in a chauffeured black Cadillac, and the license plate on it read HJ28, his initials and his 28 flavors. The last inspector left in America was the guy who invented the job. He died in June of 1972, and 18 months later the world his company was built on ended. October 1973, and the oil-producing nations of the Middle East declare an embargo against the United States. Gas lines around the block, stations running dry by noon, and a national 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. Remember 1944, 12 restaurants left because the country stopped driving? Howard Johnson's had 30 years to learn that, and instead had gone all in on the road, and roughly 85% of company revenue came from travelers. The stock hit an all-time high in 1973, then fell off a cliff and just laid there, dead, for the rest of the decade. But the embargo didn't kill Howard Johnson's. Bud's reaction to it did, and to his credit, he admitted it himself years later. He said his expansion plans stalled in the oil embargo, that he overreacted, that he stopped all expansion, and that once you stop, you know how hard it is to get the monster going again. He froze. McDonald's didn't. And in 1978, that 40-year Turnpike exclusive expired, the plazas opened to anybody, and in came Burger King and McDonald's. It turns out that when people are actually allowed to choose, a lot of them choose the burger that costs less and shows up in 90 seconds. So in 1979, Bud sold, and here comes owner number 1. The Imperial Group, a British conglomerate that made cigarettes and beer, paid around $630 million for 1,040 restaurants and 520 motor lodges. And across 4 full years of owning the largest restaurant chain in America, Imperial put $250,000 into restaurant services. Total, $250,000 across 4 years. That's not neglect, that's a landlord who already knows the building is coming down. Because that's what they'd figured out, that the money wasn't in the food, it was in the hotels, and underneath the hotels, in the dirt. Gun 3, those exit ramps, was now the only asset anybody cared about. And the restaurants were sentimental furniture sitting on the most valuable highway real estate in the United States. So Imperial gave up and sold, and here comes owner number 2. September 1985, Marriott buys Howard Johnson's for $314 million, half what Imperial paid 6 years earlier, and owner number 2 is the one that kills it. Marriott kept the 418 company-owned restaurants for the land they were standing on, and a lot of them got the orange roof torn straight off and reopened as big boys. And then, almost immediately, Marriott sold the franchise system and the lodging business to a company called Prime Motor Inns. In one afternoon, the restaurants and the hotels stopped being the same company. For 50 years, the orange roof had meant both. You ate downstairs and you slept upstairs, and it was one thing, one name, one promise, one man's word. Now the restaurants belong to one owner, and the name on the sign belonged to another, which means from that day forward, nobody ever again had both a reason to fix the restaurants and the money to do it. That's the kill shot. Everything after this is paperwork. Prime went bankrupt, then private equity, then a conglomerate called Cendant, and finally Wyndham, where the name still sits today. 6 owners, and if you add the founder and his son, that's 8 people who had the wheel. Exactly one of them ever ate the clams. So the restaurants just closed, not all at once. And that's the part that makes it sad instead of dramatic. 418 when Marriott bought in, around 110 by 1991, and a handful by the 2000s. When the Times Square location closed, Jacques Pépin, of all people, wrote its farewell in the New York Times. The man who cooked for de Gaulle wrote the eulogy. Nobody at Wyndham wrote one. Then, Bangor, Maine. 50 years in business, the last one that had run continuously since the good days, and they'd already stripped the orange roof off it by 2013, which tells you everything about how these things end. It closed in September of 2016. And that left one, Lake George, New York. And here's the last thing I want you to know about this company, because it isn't about a corporation. A man reopened that restaurant in 2015 under a grandfather clause, which is the only reason it was legally allowed to exist, and then he spent around $200,000 of his own money fixing the building up. $200,000 of his money on a building he leased for $10. More than a British conglomerate that owned the entire chain spent on all of its restaurants across 4 years. The last person who believed in Howard Johnson's was a guy in a lake town in New York with no reason to. And it still didn't work. The reviews were bad, the menu barely resembled the real thing, and after a while it opened roughly when it felt like opening. And in March of 2022, the last Howard Johnson's in the world closed for good. There was no press conference, no farewell tour, no final service. Just a restaurant in upstate New York that quietly stopped unlocking its door. Howard Deering Johnson built the whole thing on one belief, that the good version costs more and people will pay for it, and they will drive out of their way to get it. So you double the butter fat, and you cut the bellies out of the clams, and you hire the guy who cooked for de Gaulle so a highway turkey has a real onion in it. And you pay a man to drive to Ohio and taste the clams for no reason. And you sleep fine at night. And every single owner who came after him looked at that belief and saw an